Hello everyone, thank you for joining this week for problem solving session for the NPTEL certification course on environmental impact assessment being taught by Dr. Harshit Shoshan Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. I'm Isha Rathore, a PMRF teaching assistant and research scholar at the Department of Architecture and Planning at Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee. And I will be I take the problem solving sessions on Saturdays. And there is another problem solving session on Tuesday being taken by Monica S., who's another PMRF TA from the Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, IIT Kharagpur. So we're just going to wait a few more minutes for the other participants to join. Okay, so before we begin, a few housekeeping rules for the session. So please unmute yourself for the session. And if you have any questions, you can. So please mute yourself for the session and unmute yourself when you have questions or when I ask you to ask any questions or if you have any queries. In case you have any queries while the lecture portion of the video is being going on, you can post your questions in the chat box. Similarly, for the assignment questions, you can post your answers in the chat box and then we can discuss them further. So the session is divided into three sections where we have the highlights from each week, where we talk about the key takeaways or the notes from each of the lecture units. And then we have the assignment questions, which is so the assignment questions from the previous run of the environmental impact assessment course. And we have the week 4 assignment solutions because the deadline for the same has passed. So we will also discuss on the week 4 assignment questions. And then if you have any queries, which we will take up those queries in the query section. Also, we will talk about the queries which we received in the discussion forums related to this week's content. So this is the general outline of the session. So moving on, week 4 is about EIA methodologies. And we're going to dive into what are the key highlights from week 4. So week 4 had 5 lecture units, each on law, policy, and institutional arrangements for the different EIA systems. So lecture 16 talks about the EIA law, policy, and institutional arrangements for EIA system, focusing on water, soil, land, and geology aspect of the environment. So here we look at the key legislation, guidance, and standards for water. So we looked at the European Union's Water Framework Directive from the 2000s, and we looked up at the World Bank's Operational Policy 4.01, where it identified key priority areas such as considering the cross-sectional impacts of cross-sectoral impacts in a regional setting like a river basin. It also talked about restoration and preservation of aquatic ecosystems as one of its key priority area. Then we also had another key priority area on the avoidance of waterlogging and salinity problems, which are caused by irrigation and investments in irrigation. And another key priority area was the pollution and pollution reduction measures. And the pollution reduction measures and the emissions level related to the pollution, water pollution. And then we look up at the institutional structure for wastewater management in India. So we had 3 key institutions. So we have the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which is responsible for the formulation of policies and programs for the conservation of natural resources and pollution reduction. And it also provides guidance for sustainable development and enhancement of human well-being. So there are two subunits under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So we have the Central Pollution Control Board and the State Pollution Control Board. So the Central Pollution Control Board provides, please mute yourselves if you're joining now. Okay, thank you. So we have the Central Pollution Control Board and the State Pollution Control Board. So the Central Pollution Control Board provides technical service to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change in accordance with the Environment Protection Act of 1986. And particularly to water, they have the Water Act of 1974, which aims at promoting the cleanliness of streams and wells in the different areas of the state by prevention, control, and reduction of water pollution. And then the State Pollution Control Board reports to the Central Pollution Control Board, but it also has specific roles like inspecting wastewater treatment facilities, enabling the standards put forward by the CPCB, and looking at its functioning in the different states, particular states of the country. And it also looks at the methods and treatments and utilization of sewage and related disposable methods. And then the second institution related to water management in India is the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, MoHUA. So it has three key functions. So it forms policies, looks at sponsorships and support programs related to urban and uh, habitation things. And then it also looks up at the coordination of activities of various central ministries, state governments, and other institutes. And then the third is that it looks at the monitoring programs concerning the housing and urban affairs in the country. And under the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, we have the CPHEEO, which is the Central Public Health Environment Engineering Organization. So this is a technical unit under the ministry, and it specializes in public health engineering and environmental engineering. So it supports ministries' work and policy formulation, but it also looks up at providing technical advice, guidelines, scrutiny, criticism, and appraisal of schemes for the promotion and propagation of new technologies. So it is an advisory unit to the ministry at the central level and at the concerned state agencies and urban local bodies for the implementation, operation, and maintenance of the urban water supply system and the sanitation projects. So this looks at the public health aspect and engineering aspect uh, of water projects in the country. And then we have the Ministry of Jal Shakti, which was formed in May 2019 uh, by merging the Drinking Water and Sanitation Ministry, the Ministry of Water Resources, River Development, and Ganga Rejuvenation for Sustainable Development. And this was done to provide, to develop and maintain quality and efficient use of water resources. So it also has a lot of key functions. So it looks up at the overall planning and policy formulation, coordination, guidance for water projects, water resources. It provides technical guidance, scrutiny, clearance, and monitoring of irrigation, flood control, and other multi-purpose projects relating to water infrastructure. Then it gives infrastructure, technical, and research support for development. It provides central finance assistance for specific water-related projects. It provides overall policy formulation, planning, and guidance in respect to irrigation management and the development of groundwater resources. It also looks up at the national water development perspective and its formulation, and the coordination, mediation, and facilitation relating to water issues arising due to interstate conflicts, and the operation of central network for flood forecasting, interstate negotiations again, and effective reduction measures or abatement measures for pollution and rejuvenation of the river Ganga. So this is because the Ministry of Jal Shakti was formed by merging all of these other ministries at that point of time. So it has a lot of key roles being driven from all of these ministries. So it It looks up at drinking water sanitation, water resources, Ganga rejuvenation, and river development. So all of these functions and mandate of the ministries, older ministries, are being transferred in the newer functions of the ministry. So these are the uh, key institutions for water management in India. And then we also have the drinking water standards, which is the IS 10500 2012. So it talks about the drinking water specification, where it talks about certain categories, characteristics of drinking water and their permissible limits, and the method of testing. Of course, you can go much in detail about these tests if you go through the standard, which is widely available online. And then we have so in the characteristics for drinking water, it talks about the color, it talks about odor, the pH value between the scale, the taste, turbidity, how much cloudiness is in the liquid, and the total dissolved solids. So these are certain things on which the drinking water is assessed. And the CPCB provides this uh, drinking water specifications on its website if you want to go and have a look at it. And then we have standards for emission and discharge of environmental pollutants from the various industries. So you have different industries and their discharge of pollutants. So you have man-made fibers, petroleum, sugar, thermal power plants, dyes, cement plants, synthetic rubber, paper industry, fermentation industries like distilleries and breweries, leather industries. So you have all of these emission standards related to these industries. If you want to have a look again at the CPCB website. And then we had the environmental protection rules based on the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So it also talks about the general environmental pollutants, where it talks about the effluents. So for the different water areas, so like inland surface water, public sewers, land for irrigation, and marine coastal areas. So you have different standards for all of these different land uses, water uses. And then you assess them again in terms of color and odor. You assess them in terms of suspended solid particles, the particulate size of suspended solid particles. So all of these parameters are used for assessing the environmental pollutants in terms of water. And then we have the Indian sewage treatment plants or STP discharge standards over time. So we again have these water uses and the different limits for these based on the different parameters which we have. So we have the BOD, which is the biochemical oxygen demand. So this is something used for sewage treatment plant systems. So this is basically the amount of oxygen needed to break down organic matter. So this is like a natural process where it breaks down. Oxygen is used for breaking down the uh, sewage. And then we have COD, which is the chemical oxygen demand. So certain solid particles do not break down through oxygen. So you need chemical volumes for this. So this is that. Then we have total suspended solid suspended particles. You have the pH level. You have other chemical things. You have the coliform particles or the coliform virus things. So you have different limits on these on the discharge of uh, these parameters into the different water use types. And then again we have so from the Central Public Health Environmental Engineering Organization, which is again which is a subunit of the Ministry of Human and Urban Affairs. We again have recommended limits for the treated sewage quality for different uses. So you have things like toilet flushing, fire protection, vehicle washing, non-contact impoundments, and other landscape and horticulture, agriculture things. And then again, you have these similar parameters being recommended by a different authority. And so moving on, we have also a few policies and acts relating to wastewater management in India. So we have the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. So this talks about water pollution in general, but it also talks about the wholesome of water through the establishment of pollution control boards. So the CPCB and the SPCB look at the wastewater discharge as well, the parameters which we talked about in their audits. And then we have the Environmental Protection Act of the 1986, which again talks about environment in a broader sense, but it also talks about the human environment and the indoor environment and the quality of water, of course. And then we have the National Environment Tribunal Act of 1995. So this talks about strict liabilities for damages which are caused by accidents, by hazardous substances, such as the disposal of waste waste materials and other things. And then we have the National Urban Sanitation Policy, which talks about about that all Indian cities and towns should become totally sanitized, should have a good quality of public hygiene, are healthy and livable, and ensure sustainable, good public health and environmental outcomes for all their citizens. And they have a particular focus on hygiene and affordable sanitation facilities for the urban poor and women. So if you have heard about the Shilab Shauchalya schemes and all of those things, they fall under this policy. And then we have the National Mission for Clean Ganga. So this is to reduce the pollution of the of the river Ganga and to rejuvenate the river by adopting a river basin approach, that is to promote intersectoral coordination with the for comprehensive planning and management of effluents being discharged in the river, and then to maintain a minimum ecological flow in the river Ganga. So prior to the Clean Ganga Act, we had the National Mission for Clean Ganga. We had industries pouring in their wastewater into the river, which caused this large water pollution in the river. And that is when the need for a clean Ganga was realized, because Ganga is one of the holy rivers considered in our country. So this is a mission which is ongoing, and has all of these. It has these two major mandates to follow or achieve. And then we had the National Water Policy, or the NWP of 2012, which talks about recycling and reuse of water for maintaining the demands of water, because India faces water scarcity at still at rural levels. So we talk about recycling and the use of water and basically conscious use of water resources. And it talks about incentives to efficient water pricing, the efficient use of water, demand management, and all of those things. And then we have something which is the water quality criteria under the designated best use cases. So we have different classes of water. This is again prescribed by the Central Pollution Control Board. And we have the different types of designated best use. That is this water good for drinking water? Is it good for outdoor bathing? Is it good for uh, propagation of wildlife and fisheries? Is it good for irrigation of crops? And so there are certain criteria, which is in terms of the total coliforms, which is the coliform virus, which is a coliform bacteria, which is found in the fecal matter. And then we have the pH, which needs to be maintained for the uh, efficient use of these things. And the dissolved oxygen, the biochemical oxygen demand for 5 days. That is what the 5 subscript means here. And so these are the different values or parameters it needs to meet. So yes, and then it's classified in all of these classes based on whether this water is suitable for what type of purpose. So you have basically six categories, which is A, B, C, D, E, and below E when all of these other categories do not meet up. And yes. And then, so that was one aspect of lecture 16, where we talked about key legislation and guidance for standard of water. Now we have another part of the same lecture, which talks about the which talks about the key legislation, guidance, and standards for soil, land, and geology. So, in this, we looked up at the global geosite programs and the UNESCO global geoparks, which are basically protected sites. And we looked up at the UN Earth Summit Agenda 21, which had this chapter on the integrated approach to planning and management of land resources. We also have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 15, which talks about life on land and all aspects relating to life on land, including soil, geology, and all of those things. And then we had the soil thematic scheme by the European Commission in 2006, and we had the UK Comprehensive Guidance on Soil Handling for Land Resources, which is the United Kingdom's guidance on soil handling. And we have the IFC, the International Finance Commission standard third, which is the resource efficiency and pollution prevention. And we also had the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, also known as EPA. And so we had, from an Indian perspective, we had the Pollution Control Acts and rules under the defined by the CPCB again. So it talks about these different. So this is basically the schedule of the or the index of the notification being issued, and it talks about the environmental protection rules and the emissions for environmental pollutions. Then it talks about agencies and authorities and environment pollutants in general. It talks about certain areas, case study areas, and the issues which were faced in those areas. It talks about the coastal regulation zone and EIA in general. So you can have a look at this for a deeper understanding of the topic. And then we also have something as the highway projects. So because highways are prone to erosion, highway projects in hilly areas are prone to erosion. So we have like a checklist for erosion control where we talk about if this checklist meets the requirements, or will it lead to a possible risk for erosion and landslides. So this is again a checklist on constructing projects in hilly areas. So you have things like uh, measures, if necessary, measures or mitigation effects are taken against soil erosion. If you have like erosion potential, or if you have like uh, if you have tunnels that you need to deep cut through, so will it affect soil erosion and landslide risk? So all of these things are some things that you need to consider for hilly regions. And then we have certain certain assessment guidance for representativeness and reliability of baseline environmental attributes relating to soil, land, and geology. So we have for soil, we look at parameters or attributes like the particle size of soil. We look up at the texture of the soil, the pH of the soil, electrical conductivity, cation exchange capacity, alkali metals being present, sodium absorption ratio, permeability, water holding capacity, and porosity. And these are done through, we collect soil samples from each village according to the BIS specifications, the Indian standard specification. And we do this seasonally. So India has like 4 main seasons. So we do it in those 4 main seasons to look up at all of these soil characteristics. And then these are collected according to again, the set guidelines. And then for land use, we look up at the location code, which is usually the latitude, longitude. And then we look up at the project area, the topography of the site, the drainage, the natural drainage patterns. We look up at the cultivated forest plantation, water bodies, roads and settlements adjacent or near or on the site. And we take up at least 20 points along the boundary to take up these observations. And so this is done basically through the global positioning system, which is the GPS. And then for topography, we draw topo sheets on what are the latitude, what are the levels for the different slopes which are happening on the site. And then for drainage, we use again satellite imageries where we look up at the ridges and the valleys. Valleys are where the water flows through directly, and ridges are like something like mountains or high points. And then again, for cultivated forest plantation and water bodies, we use satellite imagery. And these are again subject to project specific things, but these are some of the techniques through which you measure all of these environmental parameters relating to land and geology. And then moving on to lecture 17, we talked about the law, policy, and institutional arrangement for the IA system ecology. And here we look up at the international and multilateral agreements and conventions. So we look up at the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the CBD, in 1992. So this was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit. And India became a party to this in February of 1994. So again, just to highlight, conventions and their years are important. Uh, when India joined, or whether India is a part of these convention, or if they signed these things, is important, and what year. So India joined this in February of 1994, and then so they had a biodiversity target which they set up in 2002, which was to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss by 2010 using EIA tools. And then they again met up in 2010, which was the COP 2010. So under the Rio Earth Summit, these the parties which adopted the Rio Earth Summit, they meet up every few years. They meet up like every year, and this is known as the Congregation of Parties to discuss their goals and their progress. So the Congregation of Party in 2010 was held in Nagoya, Japan, and they defined the strategic goals for biodiversity for the year 2011 and 2020, which are known as the HE biodiversity goals as well. So it basically talks about the reduction in the direct pressures faced by biodiversity and to promote sustainable use of the biodiversity and its resources. The second was to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystem, species, and genetic diversity. The third was to enhance the benefits to societies from biodiversity and ecosystem services while using a sustainable approach, of course. And then the fourth was to enhance the implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. So to bring together local people, indigenous people, and rural communities or people living in these uh, in the surrounding ecosystem to through a participatory planning approach to take their input in how best we could uh, safeguard these their ecosystem and to help them build the skills and capacity for doing so through skill development was also an important part of the Aichi Nagoya Biodiversity Convention. And the third convention was the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, 1979. This is also known as Bonn Convention, and this talks about the use of environmental impact assessment to protect threatened animals, so as their migration routes are maintained across the different seas and national boundaries. And it came into force in India in 1983. And then we had the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands of International Importance of 1971. So this talked about this identified and prioritized wetland areas, and it creates a list of wetlands which are of international importance from ecological point of view. And then we had the UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Program of 1970. So it defined biosphere reserves, which are basically globally important areas where development should be avoided, and it should be like preserved. And so there are currently 727 biosphere reserves in 131 countries, including 22 transboundary sites. That is, they share boundaries with one or more country, two or more countries, and and they belong to this network of biosphere reserves. So the UNESCO maintains this network of biosphere reserves. And the government of India implemented this program in 1986. And currently, we have 18 biosphere reserves in the country, which are categorized in the country through the IUCN. Uh, and then we had again the UNESCO World Heritage Convention in 1972. So this was to protect the natural and cultural areas of outstanding value. So they have the World Heritage Site, they have the biodiversity important areas, and this came into force in 1975 and was ratified or implemented in India in the 1977. And then another international agreement was the Berne Convention in 1979. So this was driven by the need to protect endangered species and their habitats. And so between 1989 and 1996, they made like a network of areas of special conservation interests, which support. Which support the habitats of these endangered species, and this is known as the Emerald Network. And so this is basically in the European Union at that point of time. And then 49 out of 51 European countries are signatory to this convention, and there are four African countries which have also signed this convention to protect the endangered species and their habitat. So the African countries are Burkina Faso, Senegal, Tunisia, and Morocco. And another international agreement with is the Pan-European Biological Landscape Diversity Strategy, which is also abbreviated as PEBLDS. And this was developed by the Council of Europe, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the European Centre for Nature Conservation. And so they talk about ensuring cooperation and conservation of Europe's key species and habitats and ecosystems. And they link the European protected areas in, in ecological networks. So this is basically a European strategy, but it brings all of the European national protected areas and ecological networks together in terms of their conservation strategies. And then some other European policies are the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which talks about biodiversity action plans, the Wild Bird Directive, which was again a special, which talks about maintaining special protection areas for rare species, wild bird species, and their habitats. And we have something also in the European policies, we have a Habitats Directive and its further amendments from in 1992, and it talks about special areas of conservation or SACs for protection of habitats and species using measures to maintain or restore their favorable conservation status. And they use tools such as land use and development policies, landscape management outside these special areas of conservations to safeguard species which need strict protection. And they have the Water Framework Directive, which uh, which is again towards the management of aquatic, wetland, and territorial ecosystems, and to achieve a good status under the Water Framework Directive by the year 2027. So between 2015 and 2027. And then we look up at, in lecture 17, we look up at the national and regional legislation on ecology. So we have the EIA notification, which whose general condition is that any project or activity which is specified a category B will be treated as category A if it's located in whole or in part within 10 kilometers from the boundary of. So basically, for category B, you do not need to for so if for category B, you do not need EIA, like a total EIA thing, but for category A, you need to do EIA and show EIA. So category B will be treated as category A if it is located in its 10 kilometers, if it's located in the proximity of protected areas under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. or if it is located within 10 kilometers in a critically polluted areas which are identified by the CPCB, or if it is located in eco-sensitive areas as notified under Section 3 of Environmental Protection Act. And these are certain areas like Mahabaleshwar, Pachgani, Mathiran, Pachmadi, Doon Valley, Dahuna. So all of these eco-sensitive areas, and or if it lies between interstate boundaries and international boundaries. So the category changes when it is close to all of these areas within its 10 kilometers boundary. And then we have so we have two types of legislation. We have the comprehensive and the specific legislations. So comprehensive legislations are measures which protect habitat, species, and areas under a single overarching act. So everything is included in the comprehensive legislation, whereas specific legislation relates to protection of specific areas or habitats or species. So specific legislation has a limited scope or has a very targeted action, whereas comprehensive covers everything in a larger bucket of things to achieve. So, comprehensive legislation examples include Wildlife Conservation and Management Act in Kenya, the Indian Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which was amended in 2006, and the UK Wildlife and Countryside Act of 1985, sorry, and which was again amended at some point. And then for specific legislation, we have so in these three categories, which is areas, habitats, and species. So for the protection of areas, we have like National Park legislation of 1980. We have the New Zealand National Parks Act of 2003. We have the South Africa Areas Act. So these are areas which protect the specific legislation which protect these specific areas. And then for protection of specific species, we have the 1992 UK Protection of Badgers Act. So they protect this species of badgers. And for habitat or land use protection, we have the forest laws of Brazil and India. So they protect the habitat or land use of forests in these countries. So they are very specifically targeted towards protection of specific categories of ecosystem things. And again, we have a few examples again of uh, national and regional legislation for the different countries of the world. So we have Kenya Wildlife Conservation Management Act 2013. We have India Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, which was amended in 2006. We have the UK Wildlife and Countryside Act 1985. We have the 1980 New Zealand National Park Act, which targets specific areas, habitats. We have the 2003 South Africa Protected Areas Act, which is again specific area act, specific legislation. In 1992, we also had the UK Protection of Badgers Act, which is the Species Act, the Forest Laws of Brazil, Forest Laws of India, which is habitat and land use specific legislation. Okay. And in India, we also have we have these following targets or conventions which we have to achieve. So, according to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change annual report, we currently have the conservation relating to biodiversity. We follow the Convention of Biological Diversity, which is the CBD from the Rio Earth Summit. And we also follow the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, ABS. We also have the National Biodiversity Action Plans, NBAP, National Biodiversity Targets, NBTs, National Report to we send the national report to the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and we have the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and we have domestic measures like Biodiversity Act of 2002 and National Biodiversity Authority, NBA. So these are important legislations or things that we follow international as well as national things. So on the again, yeah. So and then we move on to the codes of in lecture 17. We also talked about the codes and practices and the best practices. So we have the AIA guidance being given by the UK Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, IEEM. And we also have the Ministry of Environment, Finance, Forest and Climate Change, which provides a manual and guidance for ecology management. And we have certain bilateral funding agencies which fund ecological protection projects, which are like the Danish International Development Agency, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA. So these provide funding to ecosystem projects for conservation and preservation of ecological systems. And then we also have the PS6 from the International Finance Corporation, IFC, the mitigation, hierarchy, and classification of habitat. So we have four types of hierarchy. We have modified land, which has changed its land use over time. We have natural habitat, which is the same type of land use that the area or the habitat has been assigned or was as it has existed over all of these years. And then we have critical habitat, which is threatened. And then we have like legally protected and internationally recognized areas by the various authorities. And it also provides the guidance on invasive alien species which are not native, but which crop up due to certain things. So it provides guidance on how to deal with invasive alien species as well. And then another topic which we talked about was the special interest groups. So in lecture 17, so these are groups uh, which have a special interest or conservation target, and they they have to define their scope, technical competence, validity, and proposed mitigation measures, and they also have to uh, they also have like special interest in conservation areas, such as they can be aiming towards the conservation of particular species or particular areas or habitats. So, for example, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds in the UK and the Audubon Society in the US. So, these are special interest groups which have specific targets or specific interests that they want to protect. And things like the local museums and data centers and non-professional special interest groups such as local natural history or wildlife groups or cultural groups which meet up, the bird observing groups, all of those things come as special interest groups. But special interest groups which have a very specific professionally defined targets are examples like these, and non-professional special interest groups can be something which has a interest towards protecting something but do not are not very professionally obliged to do that. So these are the special interest groups. And then moving on to lecture 18, this talked about the law, policy, and institutional arrangements for the EIS system, focusing on coastal ecology and geomorphology. So first we look up at the authorities. So we have the Indian institutions which are responsible for decision making. So we have a few Indian institutions which look up at the coastal ecology and geomorphology aspects. So first we have the Ministry of Environment and Forests. So this looks up at the resources in coastal waters. This also has a nodal ministry whose major responsibility is for protecting the marine environment, including the implementation of the legislative measures and rules which they form. Then we have the Department of Ocean Development, which monitors the marine environment, which manages the resources in the high seas. The Ministry of Agriculture, which looks up in the fisheries, aquaculture, fish processing aspect. The Ministry of Water Resources, which looks up at erosion caused by water bodies. Then we also have the Ministry of Defense or the Indian Coast Guard, which looks up at pollution response measures, including oil pollution through oil spills and effluents being discharged from the industries. Then we have Ministry of Surface Transportation, which looks up at the ports, shipping, etc. And the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, which looks up at the offshore installation of petroleum plants, the coastal refineries, pipelines, etc., and to ensure that these do not cause uh, an accident or a disaster in terms of oil spills and things. And then we have Ministry of Tourism and Ministry of Mines, which look up at tourism activities in the coastal areas and the mining activities in these coastal areas. So these are the few Indian institutions which are responsible for maintaining the coastal ecology. And then we have a few international agreements and Indian legislation which is related to the coastal and marine biodiversity. So we have the CBD from the Rio Earth Summit. Then we have the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. We also looked at this as a Bonn Convention. Previously, we have the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Sites, which looks up at the international trade agreements for the endangered species or threatened species between the different countries. Uh, and then we have the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, ITPGR, and the Ramsar Convention or the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, where they define wetlands of international importance and conserve them. And we have the World Heritage Convention, WHC. We have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, Hyogo and Sengai frameworks for action specifically for disaster risk management. The United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, UN clause, which talks about all matters relating to sea. The Agreement on Straddling Fish Stocks, High Migratory Fish Stocks, London Convention on the prevention of marine pollution, of dumping waste and other matters. The Basel Convention, which talks about the control of transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal measures. The Food and Agriculture Organization, which also has a code of conduct for responsible fishery, which is CCRF. International Principles on Responsible Shrimp Farming, International Convention for Regulation of Whaling, International Convention on Pollution, Prevention of Pollution from Ships. So these are few international agreements, specifically relating to coastal zones. And then looking at the different ministries and the laws which falls under their purview, which falls under their implementation. So we looked up at all of these ministries previously. So we have the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, MOEFCC. So it implements these following laws, which is the Coastal Regulation Zone Notification. So we have different zones near to the coastal region, which we look at further. We have the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. We have the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974. We looked at this in the water in lecture 16. Then we have the Hazardous Waste Management Act 1989. We also looked at this in the water module. We have the Environmental Impact Assessment Notification, which talks about the change of categories when it's near to a eco-sensitive zone. We also look up at the Environmental Protection Act and the Indian Wildlife Protection Act, the Biological Diversity Act. So all of these fall under the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change purview. So this ministry is responsible for the implementation and following of these acts in these areas. And then we also have the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Animal Husbandry, Dairying and Fisheries. So this is responsible for deep sea fishing policy, Indian Fisheries Act, the Marine Fisheries Regulation Act. So anything related to fishing, aquaculture, and all of those things. Then the Ministry of Defense, which looks up at the ports through the Indian Ports Act, the Major Port Trust Act, and the Merchant Shipping Act. So maintaining the activities and the maintaining the activities in the ports area. And then we have the Ministry of Shipping, which looks up at the Coastal Guard Act, the Maritime Zone Act. So these two acts fall with the Ministry of Shipping. And so this is the Coastal Regulation Zone Notification. So it basically defines the coastal area from the tide lines into a number of zones. And this is done to ensure that the livelihood security of fishing communities and other local communities are living in these coastal areas, and to conserve and protect these coastal regions. And then also to promote development in a sustainable manner, such that there are no dangers of natural hazards or accidents happening in these areas due to the rising sea level because of global warming. So we have okay, so we first define the low tide line and then the high tide line. And then we have the 50-meter line from the high tide line, which is defined as the no development zone. And then we also have a 200-meter line, which is the no development zone, or the NDZ. So the NDZ is basically 50 meters from high tide line in CRZ3 areas, and 200 meters from the high tide line in CRZ3B areas. So we will go into what are these areas now. So CRZ1A is the eco-sensitive area. So CRZ1A is like the protected or the dense forest area or the eco-sensitive zone, whose disruption will cause a major impact, major ecological impact, something like a dense forest area. So this is CRZ1A. And then CRZ1B is the intertidal area. So CRZ1B is close to the shoreline, and it's where the tides wash up. So like high tides will wash up in CRZ1B areas. And CRZ2 is areas in which have been developed up to or close to the shore. So CRZ2 areas are like areas which have developments, and CRZ3 3As are so CRZ3 areas are divided into two parts, which are CRZ coastal regulation zone. CRZ is coastal regulation zone. So CRZ3A and 3B. So 3A is where population density is more than 2,161 square kilometer as per the 2011 census. So CRZ3A is like this, and then CRZ3B is like areas with population density of less than what CRZ3A has as per the 2011 census. So these are defined based on the population density divided into if it's higher, it's 3A, and if it's lower, it's 3B. And then CRZ4 is again divided into two parts, which is CRZ-A and B, 4A and B. So 4A is is 12 nautical miles from low tide line towards the sea. So this is CRZ4. So this is basically where the shipping activities happen. And then we have the 4B, which is tidal influence water bodies. So these are basically the coastal regulation zones defined such that development activities and coastal activities can be assigned to specific areas and maintained in those specific areas based on the scientific reasoning and principles of whether it will cause risk and risk to development activities because of rising sea levels, or will it threaten certain areas of development that happen is planned in those areas. So these are just to ensure that a sustainable form of coastal development happens. And this falls under the Ministry of Forest and Environment and Climate Change purview. So it's the MOFCC, which maintains these coastal regulation zones. And then we also have the Wetlands Conservation and Management Rules of 2010. So wetlands are basically areas of marsh, peatland, or water. They can be natural or artificial. They can be permanent or temporary. They can have water which is static, like the mangroves, or it can be flowing, like the river basins and things. Or it can include marine water, it can include salt water, the depths of which at low tide does not exceed 6 meters, and include all inland waters such as lake, reservoirs, tanks, backwaters, lagoons, creeks, estuaries, and man-made wetlands, and the zones of direct influence on wetlands. So wetlands are basically areas where water is present, and they have these guidelines where the depth of Depth of water at low tide does not exceed 6 meters, and it includes all inland water forms. So if you look at this image, so all of these are like wetland areas. So you have the river floodplains, you have the marshes, you have estuaries or swamps like mangroves, or you have the human or man-made water bodies being formed because of dams. You have oxbow lakes formed by lake water being separated because of sedimentation. And according to the National Wetland Conservation Programs, we have quite a few wetlands under the NWCP. All of these are located in different states, and they are identified. So wetlands are also identified under the Ramsar Convention for the protection of wetlands of international importance. Okay, and then we also have the marine protected areas or the MPAs, which are basically space in the ocean where human activities are more strictly regulated than the surrounding waters. And these places are given special protection for natural or historic marine resources by the local, state, territorial, native, regional, or national authorities. So these are basically areas which are more where human activities are more regulated, specifically in the context of oceans, similar to what we have like parks on lands, which are regulated and maintained. And they have the special protection from a natural or historic marine resources perspective, which is again given by any of these authorities. So something like the marine protected areas in India, like the Pulicat Lake in Andhra Pradesh. Uh, yeah. And then, so this is the Pulicat Lake, which is in Andhra Pradesh. And we have the Campbell Bay in Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So these are again protected, marine protected areas or MPAs. So activities which are permissible under various conservation levels in these MPBAs are, so we have like different categories. We have like national parks, sanctuaries, community reserves, conservation reserves, the different type of conservation biodiversity protected areas. And we have activities like research, non-extractive traditional use, where you do not take out any of the products of these from these areas. You have non-extractive recreation, example tourism, that you just go and visit these areas. You have shipping, except as may be unavoidable under international maritime law. You have fishing, traditional fishing. You have untreated water discharge, if it's allowed or not. You have fishing collection, like local fishing, sustainable local fishing. Then you have harbor sports, other things, mining under the sea floor, and then renewable energy generation, if all of these things are allowed. So research is allowed with permission in all of these areas, but you cannot do a lot of the other things, which is some of these national parks are not open for tourism as well. Some of them are open for tourism, but with restrictions on what sort of activities are allowed and not. So all of these activities are being maintained and sort of regulated to keep the conservation levels in these protected areas. So we have the Indian Wildlife Protection Act, the WPA, in the context of the uh, marine protected areas. So we have the Wildlife Protection Amendment Act of 1991, which talks about to protect marine flora and fauna. And it also, the Wildlife Protection Act in 2002 introduced protected areas through the inclusion of a section 224. And in this, the protected area is defined as a national park, a sanctuary, a conservation reserve, or a community reserve. And it's notified under the different sections of the Act and defined under those different sections of the Act. So we now look up at what are these definitions of these protected areas. So we have sanctuaries. So sanctuaries are for the purpose of protecting, propagating, or developing wildlife or its environment, and the areas which have like adequate ecological flora, fauna, geomorphology, the natural or geological significance can be declared as sanctuaries. And they are generally declared by the state government or the central government. So these are basically areas which which help in protecting and propagating the wildlife. specifically from the perspective of like a rare ecology, rare fauna, flora, uh, geomorphology or other natural or geological significance. And then we have the national parks, which are areas of ecology, fauna, flora, geomorphology, and they are declared as national parks for protecting, propagating, or developing wildlife or its environment. And they are again declared by the state government or by central government. So the difference between sanctuaries and national parks is that sanctuaries are for protecting and preserving specific areas, whereas national parks are for protecting like a habitat of all of these things working together. And then we have the conservation reserve, which was introduced again in the amendment, which we listened to in the previous slides. So it has two objectives, which is to improve the socioeconomic conditions of the people living in these areas and for the conservation of wildlife. So conservation reserves are generally areas which are owned by the state government, and they are adjacent to or linked to protected areas where all of these people live, and they sort of have a participatory planning approach to the conservation of these areas. And then we also had looked up at the policies and guidance relating to coastal ecology and geomorphology. So there are basically we look up at the carrying capacity of the coastal environment, how much stress it can take. And then we also have something like the Integrated Coastal Zone Management, the ICZM, which looks up at the development of the coastline in a very sustainable and integrated manner. And then a few guidances are being provided uh, in these plans, which are from different sources. So you have the UK shoreline management plans, you have the estuary management plans, you have the coastal habitat management plans. So few of these guidances can be taken from these references. And then we also have the Initiative for Flood and Coastal Defense Work. So this was adopted by the European Commission in 2030 for providing a framework for the spatial planning and integrated coastal management. And through this, we have like the coastal management strategies, which is the integrated coastal zone management, which we talked about in the policies. And yeah, that was all for the coastal ecology and geomorphology. And then we move on to lecture 19, which talks about the EIA law, policy, and institutional arrangements, specifically from a noise perspective. So we first look up at the international level legislation, guidance, and standards relating to noise. So we have the European directive, which talks about the permissible sound levels from vehicle exhaust systems. And then we have specific to the European countries. And then we have the US federal emission standards for the USA, which comes under the Noise Control Act of 1972. And we have noise maps, which are basically that countries develop noise maps for the given land use, density, project areas, and they manage noise where necessary, and to prevent also to prevent noise from being generated in specified quieter areas. So for example, you have areas where honking is not allowed, or the car horns are not allowed, especially like hospitals and schools. So these are basically noise maps where the countries have decided that these specific activities will be disturbed by high level noise. Also, you have like if you have construction activities in areas, you have to uh, provide like a mitigation effect, or you have to work on a particular timeline such that it does not affect the functioning of the other uh, spaces. And then we look up at the standards and guidelines for measuring and assessing noise and vibration. So we have key standard guidelines from, so we have the standard and guidelines here. And then this is their title, of course. And then we have the description of what they do. So we have the ISO 1996 to 2007. So this is basically description, measurement, and assessment of environmental noise, part 2, where it determines the levels of environmental noise. And it provides sound pressure levels, talks about procedures for measuring these sound pressure levels and instruments, and then their calculation, their recommended values from calculations, and it provides guidelines on eliminating uncertainty from these calculations as well. And then we have the ISO 96132, which was introduced in 1996. So this talks about acoustics, which is sound attenuation of sound during propagation outdoors, and general methods of calculation. So it looks up at the prediction of noise levels in communities from sound sources. And then it talks about the different categories, and then it provides the algorithms for the uh, uh, maintaining a good acoustics in the indoors because of outdoor noise. And then we have the International Institute of Noise Control Engineering, which provides the guidelines for community noise impact assessment and mitigation. So this is a non-technical guidance uh, tool, and it's used by policy makers to look up at the noise regulation and control through AIA, and it gives like a broad approach to understanding noise impact assessment and to center and plan your land use activities according to the control exposure to environmental noise. And then we have the WHO organization guidelines for Europe, where it talks about the health impact of noise on through different noise producing sources, and provides a target for uh, different types of land uses, but it majorly looks up at the health impact of noise. And then we have the Association of Noise Consultants 2012, which looks up at the measurement and assessment of ground-borne noise and vibration. So any noise being particularly some railway vibration and ground-borne noise is it provides guidance on these problems, and it looks up at their procedures, criteria, equipment adopted across the industry, and the provides advice on overcoming the problems relating to these things. And then we have the British standard, which is again a code of practice for noise and vibration control on construction and open sites. So this is basically because construction activities tend to generate a lot of noise, specifically if you have a larger project. So you need to uh, maintain your noise levels. And so it talks about the construction and open sites activities and controlling noise and vibration in those areas. Again, vibration is one of the main problems being faced in construction activities. So that is also one of the vibration control aspect being looked up by the British standard. And then we have the Environmental Protection Authority, EPA, which is an Australian standard, which looks up at the consideration of environmental impact from noise and how it's assessed within the EIA process, how it can be regulated, and it provides standards and direct components in terms of regulatory standards and technical guidance. And then we have Environmental Protection Department Hong Kong's EIA ordinance for the guidelines for noise assessments, uh, how to adopt approaches and methodology for assessment of noise and EIA projects. So this is from Hong Kong. And then we have the British standard again, which is for methods of rating and assessing industrial and commercial noise. So the previous British standard was for construction activities and control of noise and vibration. And this is on how industrial and commercial sound should be assessed and weighted. So they have a rating penalty, which is subject to a few conditions and characteristics being met, but they look up at the noise being generated from industries and commercial activities, and it rates them and provides guidance on reducing it. Then we have another British standard on sound insulation and noise reduction for buildings. So providing sound insulation and how much sound insulation to provide, and for new buildings, for already built buildings or refurbished buildings which are undergoing a change of use. So these are again based on the internal and external noise values in their surroundings. Yes, and then another British standards on the evaluation of human exposure to vibration in buildings and vibration sources other than blasting. So it looks up at the magnitude of vibration and provides guidelines around it. And then the second part, which is again guide to damage levels from ground-borne vibration. So again, vibration from the ground, which can cause damage to the building. So it is looking at that damage levels. And then we have the Environmental Agency 2004 providing the horizontal guidance for noise, for noise control and noise assessment and control. And it provides controls for noise through design, operational management techniques, and reduction technologies. And then we have the Department for Transport and Welsh Office, 1988, looking at calculation of road traffic noise, CRTN. And it looks up at the road traffic noise levels and the factors like traffic, volume, speed, road gradient, road surface, barrier screening, and all of those things, reflection from facades. And then provides methods for calculating and measuring these noise levels. And then we have the Highway Agency's 2011 design manual for roads and bridges, again, from the perspective of assessing the impact in terms of noise and vibration. So these were international standards. Now moving on to the national noise levels and guidance. So we have so these are some of them are not directly related, but they are important for quoting in your complaints. So the Constitution of India has Article 21, which grants the right to life to citizens of life, and this is to live with dignity or to have a right to a better life. And then we have the Code of Criminal Procedure, which is Section 131, 133 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, which empowers any executive magistrate, district magistrate, or subdivisional magistrate to conditionally remove something that is causing a nuisance. So you can remove someone causing uh, a noise uh, impact in your area, which is again uncalled for or is above certain specified levels. And then we have the Indian Penal Code, which has a chapter 14 on which deals with the offenses relating to noise pollution. So you have section 268, 287, 288, 290, 291, and 294, which deals specifically with noise pollution. So something like high level of noise after 10 p.m. in India is not considered a good I mean, you can remove the noise source after 10 p.m. in India, so something like that. And then we have a law of torts, which is noise pollution can be included under the offense of nuisance under the law of torts. And any person who is facing an issue due to such noise pollution can file a civil suit to claim damages. And then we have the Motor Vehicle Act, which lays down guidelines for the use of horns in specific areas and vehicles. And if your horns are too loud and cause nuisance, they are not allowed to be used under this act. And then we have the National Pollution Control under the Code of Criminal Procedure 1973. So this can be invoked to prevent pollution of almost all kinds, including the noise pollution. And you have section 133 and 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code. And they are authorized to remove the judges are basically authorized to issue conditional orders. So we looked up at 133 in the previous slide. And then we also, under the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981, I mean, the Air Act is basically exclusively for air pollution in terms of effluents, but it also mentions the problem of noise uh, in the definition of air pollution and in the air pollutants. And so noise pollution can be controlled under various provisions of this act. And so we have section 1626, which talks about of the Air Act, which is a function of CPCB. And it can be used to plan and cause to be executed to execute a nationwide program for prevention, control, and abatement of air pollution. So, under the pollutants parameter of the act, we also have noise pollutants. So, this act also covers noise pollution apart from being just air emission pollutants. And then we have the Environment Protection Act 1986 and Environment Protection Rules 1986. So uh, we have the government, the central government can make rules regarding the maximum allowable limits of concentration of various environment pollutants, including noise, in the different areas. The central government can also make noise pollution control rules uh, around the maximum allowable limits of noise in the environment, so like in the outdoor and the indoor environment. And there's also entry 89 in Schedule 1, which which provides noise standards for firecrackers and prohibits the manufacture, use, and sale of firecrackers which generate a higher noise level, which is exceeding 125 decibels. Uh, yeah. And then, so in terms of actions that the CPCB can take in respect to noise pollution, you have the CPCB prepares the formulation of noise mapping, and it communicates chief secretaries of all states or union territories via letter, and they focus on issues relating to noise level monitoring by the police department and initiation of actions if the noise level is above the limit specified. And they also mention that the police department can they can obtain noise monitoring devices. And so this was done in 2020, where this letter was sent to the chief secretaries of states and union territories by the CPCB, which specified this framework on controlling noise pollution specifically from vehicles. And they empowered the police department to execute noise level monitoring at different points. And they also issued like noise monitoring devices, measurement tools for to the police department of different states, and they trained these personnel regarding the use of these devices to have a better monitoring and control of noise pollution being caused by vehicles. So that was all about law. So as a side note, I would like to add that I think India has a higher level of noise pollution because of road traffic compared to other countries. Because I mean, I've been living in UK for like the past 1 year, and I feel like the noise levels here are much lower than those in India. So, for example, the cars do not even honk as much or use their horns as much, whereas in India it's like a continuous cacophony of horns you keep listening. So that is why I think the CPCB has started monitoring and regulating the noise pollution. So moving on to lecture 20, we talked about law, policy, and institutional arrangements from the ecosystem services point of view. So in the previous lectures, we have looked up at ecosystem services in terms of the four categories, which were provisioning services, regulating services, supporting services, and cultural services. So provisioning services are like something which are directly obtained by the ecosystem, like products and things. So, for example, food, medicine, timber, fiber, bioenergy. These are all services which we obtain from the ecosystem as a product. Then we have regulating services, which help in the regulation and maintenance of the ecosystem as well, and the environment in general. So something like water filtration, waste decomposition to natural means, climate regulation, crop pollination by bees and other pollinators, regulation of some human disease. Uh, so these are regulating services which help to maintain the balance of the ecosystem. So services of the ecosystem which helps in maintaining the ecosystem balance itself, regulating services. Then we have supporting services which help support ecosystem processes like nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, soil formation. So supporting services for the functioning of ecosystems. And then we have cultural services which helps in the propagation and maintenance of culture and regional context. So these are enriching recreational, aesthetic, spiritual practices. So these are the four categories of ecosystem services that benefit human beings. And then we have something which is defined as the gross ecosystem product, or the GEP. So GEP is the total value of the final ecosystem goods and services which is supplied to human beings in a region annually, and it can be measured in terms of biophysical value or monetary value. So if you look at all of these services, these are basically services. But if you look at the monetary value or the biophysical value of all of these services which a human being receives um, from the ecosystem over in a region over a year, that is known as the gross ecosystem product, similar to gross development product, but in terms of ecological product. And then so these ecosystems can be measured include the natural ecosystems like forests, grassland, wetlands, desert, freshwater, ocean. And it can also include artificial ecosystems, which are like farmlands, pastures, aquaculture farms, urban greenland, so anything. So these are basically indicators which are used to measure the economic value of ecosystem services. And then we also looked up at the IUCN and India and their various themes. So we looked up at mangroves and the problems. So basically problems which India faces specifically in these different themes. So overall, in general, we have the mangroves of the future MFF. So they talk about the threats to all coastal and marine ecosystem and communities across Asia, and in India specifically because of the uh, socioeconomical resilience of the local coastal communities and their dependence on these mangroves. And they talk about strengthening the livelihood and income security, making science-based policy regulations, knowledge and awareness of these communities, which are dependent on the mangroves, and the capacity building of these stakeholders. Then, in terms of species, we still face the illegal killing of animals, so monitoring that aspect because of the elephant horn being used in medicines and beauty products. And then we also have the collaboration under the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna. So this is also one of uh, aspects. So because the elephants are being killed for their horn, but it's also being transported to other countries. So this also forms like a link between a better regulation for sites. And so the key outputs were to support elephant range countries in tracking trends relating to the illegal killing of elephants. And this is predominantly popular in Africa and Asia, which has the higher population of elephant species. And then in terms of water, we identified the regional capacity building, which is water governance projects being undertaken because India does face water scarcity at several rural levels. So to combat that, then we have the in the theme forest, we have the forest landscape restoration, the regaining the ecological functionality, and enhancing uh, natural forest landscape uh, in improving the human well-being, and the overall uh, whole landscape forward plan, which is to meet the present and future needs and to offer multiple benefits in land use over time. And then in terms of climate change, they identified that the initiatives have to be taken in the Himalayan region, where it looks like climate change will have a significantly higher impact, specifically in the three Himalayan states of Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, and Sikkim. So this is based on the IUCN action areas being identified in India. And then in terms of business and biodiversity, again, they look up at key key points like the Leaders for Nature program, the Sustainable Agriscape for Future program. And then In lecture 20, we also look up at the international agreements and policy objectives from the ecosystem services or biodiversity conservation point. And we have looked up at most of these in previous slides as well, because they are more of a uh, comprehensive themes instead of being very specific theme based. So we have the CBD, the sites, the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals. Then you have the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resource for Food and Agriculture, the Convention on Wetlands, the Ramsar Convention, World Heritage Convention, International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC. And then we have certain national agreements as well, which is the Environmental Protection Act, Forest Conservation Act, Wildlife Protection Act. We have the Indian Forest Act, the Forest Rights Act, the Biological Diversity Act, Protection of Plant Varieties and Farmers' Rights Act, the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dweller Act, which looks up at the rights and uh, ecosystem benefits of indigenous species. And we have the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, Water Cess Act, Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, Public Liability Insurance Act. So these were acts from the Indian context. And then we also have initiatives like the Natural Capital Accounting and Valuation of Ecosystem Services, or the NCAVS project. So this was funded by the European Union and jointly implemented by the United Nations Statics Division, United Nations Environment Program, and the Convention of Biological Diversity, CBD. And so India, so there are basically five countries which took part in this project, including India. So these other countries were Brazil, China, South Africa, and Mexico. And so this was done in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment, Finance, and Climate Change, and Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change, and the National Remote Sensing Centers under the Department of Space. So what it does is it provides a systematic way to measure and report on stocks and flows of natural capital. So a very financial perspective to ecosystem services. So natural capital is another term for the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that yield benefits to people. So in terms of stocks, they have defined natural capital in terms of benefits uh, being given to the people. And then it compiles these national accounts in a system of national accounts, the SNA, for natural capital accounting, which is the system of environmental economic accounting, SEEA. And it provides a framework for measuring the link between the environment and the economy in terms of it's like a stock based financial accounting measure by the countries. And then the second initiative is the NV Stats India. So it looks up at the environmental statistics dimensions of environment, earth, water, or air, and the other bio and biotic and abiotic matter. And it looks up at the various concerns arising out of the impact of human activities on it. And it provides information about these factors and changes over time, and looks up at the trends and um, action areas and mitigation efforts to influence them. And then another initiative is the National Mission for Green India, which is GIM. And this was launched in February of 2014. And it has two objectives. One is to safeguard the biological resources and associated livelihoods against the dangers of climate change. And the second is to recognize the vital impact of forestry on ecological sustainability, biodiversity conservation, and food, water, and livelihood security. And then we have certain international examples for policy and regulations. You can look at this from the slides. And so then there is a guidance on integrating ecosystem services in the ESIA. Again, these are just guidance for ecosystem services. So this was the broad overview of what was discussed in week 4. So we will now look up at the questions from the previous one of the course. And some of these questions were repeated in the week's assignment as well. So we will also discuss week four's assignment because the deadline for the same has passed. And so you can post your answers in the chat. I will look up at the chat. So the first question is the standard IAS 10500 in India provides permissible and desirable limits for various parameters of drinking water. So we discussed this in our review as well. Is this statement true or false? Okay. So again, standards and things are important. So the statement is true. The Indian standard 10500 provides a drinking water specification, and it has this. Um, it has these tables on which look up at the characteristics of drinking water and their permissible limits for the different sources. So the statement is true. So true is the correct answer. So moving on to question 2, state true or false. UNESCO global geoparks are important for conservation, protection, and management of their fossils, stratigraphy, minerals, and other geological interests. Is the statement true or false? You can post your answers in the group chat. Okay. Yes, we have an answer. True, true is correct. Yes, geoparks are important for conservation, protection, and management for all the natural and cultural heritage of that area. And this is from the Global Geopark site from UNESCO, and they also talk about the same thing, that they are sites and landscapes of international geological significance, managed with a holistic concept of protection, education, and sustainable development. So moving on to question 3. So this is match the sustainable development goals as mentioned in group A with their respective themes in group B. So group A has sustainable development goals and group B has the themes. So you need to match which goal meets with which goals. Okay, we have an answer C. C is the correct answer. So sustainable development goal 2 is about zero hunger and it matches with 1, which is end hunger, achieve food security and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. Sustainable development goal 12 is on responsible consumption and production and it matches with 3, which is to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And Sustainable Development 15 is on life on land, which talks about protecting, restoring, and promoting sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss. So option C is correct. That is P matches with 1, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 2. So moving on to question 4, which is again a true or false question. So state true or false. Development has the potential to convert contaminated land to uncontaminated land and vice versa without actually changing the chemistry of the ground at depth. So is this statement true or false? Okay, so we have an answer. Yes, the statement is true. So development can be so if you have a contaminated land like landfills, and if you build a building on a landfilled area, you basically change the land use uh, of the uh, of the land, and it basically converts from contaminated land to uncontaminated land without actually changing the chemistry of the ground at depth. So you don't actually change anything, but you just change the land use and change it from undeveloped land to developed land, and it changes its contaminated status from contaminated to uncontaminated through this process. So the statement was true. Moving on to question 5, state true or false. India is not a signatory of the Convention of Biological Diversity, CBD, under the Rio Earth Summit. So is the statement true or false? The statement is basically saying that India is not a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Not is the keyword. So is the statement true or false? We discussed this in our review of the session as well. Okay. So the answer is false because India is a signatory of the Convention on Biological Diversity. But so the keyword was not, which was India. It's saying that India is not a signatory of CBD, but India is a signatory of CBD, having signed it in February 1994. So you need to look up at the statement and the keyword and the implied meaning of the keyword. So the statement is false. India is a signatory of the CBD, and it presents the CBD reports at regular intervals on its progress. So moving on to question 6, which of the following provide key codes of practices related to ecology? So you have one, performance standards from the International Finance Commission; two, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD; three, Asian Development Bank, ADB; and four, African Development Bank, AFDB. So which of the following provide key codes of practices relating to ecology? So we discussed about a few of them. Okay. So the correct answer is D, all of them. That is, all of these uh, agencies provide key codes of practices related to ecology. So you have performance standards from IFC, and we have the other banks and development banks which provide practices for relating to ecology. So the correct answer was D, all of the above. Okay, moving on to question 7. We have the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, RSPB in the UK, is an example of special interest group. So is the statement true or false? We discussed this in our highlight section as well. So special interest groups are areas which these are basically groups which are focused on the protection and preservation of specific species or birds or uh, habitats. So they have a very specific niche target area which they want to achieve. And the Royal Society for Protection of Birds is one of them. So the statement is true. And they basically have five main work areas, which is science, species, places, people, and policy. And they look up at protecting habitats, saving species, and help to end the nature and climate emergency. So the correct answer is true. It is a special interest group in the UK. So moving on to question 8, match the Indian institute mentioned in Group A with the responsibilities in coastal areas in Group B. So Group A has institutions specific to India, and Group B has their responsibilities in the context of coastal areas. So you need to match Group A with Group B. So another keynote here for your examinations, agencies and their roles are also important. So you need to remember the roles and the responsibilities of agencies and what they do in the various parameters of the environment which we discuss. Okay, so the correct answer is C, that is The Ministry of Environment and Forest looks after the management of resources in the coastal water, and the nodal ministry with major responsibility for protecting marine environment includes the implementation of legislative measures. So the Ministry of Environment and Forest does these roles. So P matches with 4. The Ministry of Agriculture is responsible for the development of fishery, aquaculture, fish processing. So this is 3. So this basically like fish farming, aquaculture, fisheries, fish processing. So Q matches with 3, and then Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas looks up at offshore installations, coastal refineries, and pipelines. So R matches with 1. And the Ministry of Defense, Indian Coast Guard looks up at the pollution response measures, including oil pollutions. So S matches with 2. So the correct answer was C, that is P matches with 4, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1, and S matches with 2. So the ministries and their roles are important, so keep a note of this. Moving on to question 9, match the terms in group A with their description in group B. So you have the marine conserved areas and their definitions in group B. So you need to match group A with group B. So definitions are again important. Okay. Okay. So D is the correct answer. So sanctuaries match with 3, which is for the purpose of protecting, propagating, or developing wildlife or its environment. The areas having adequate ecological fauna, flora, geomorphology, natural or geological significance. National park matches with 1, which is areas of ecological fauna, flora, geomorphology, and geological association. uh, or importance, and they may be declared for protecting, propagating, or developing wildlife or its environment. So the key difference between sanctuaries and national parks is the word adequate and uh, conservation. So Q matches with 1 and P matches with 3. Then conservation reserves are areas which are owned by state government and are adjacent to or linked to protected areas. We discussed this in the highlights. So R matches with 4. And community reserves are protected areas, privately owned land, either by an individual or the entire community, which includes wildlife resources. So S matches with 2. So the correct answer was D, which you guys guessed. So P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 2. So moving on to question 10. Again, state true or false. World Health Organization WHO gives noise guidelines based on health parameters for specific environments. Is the statement true or false? Okay, we have an answer. The statement is true. That is correct. So the WHO gives environmental noise guidelines for the European region, and it has a recommendation based on the type of the noise source, and then it also has the implications of these noise sources on health impacts, and then it provides guidelines based on these health parameters for these specific environments. So the statement was true. So moving on to question 11, match the IFC performance standards mentioned in Group A with their themes in Group B. So in Group A, we have the performance standards from the International Finance Commission. And in Group B, we have the themes relating to these performance standards. So the IFC performance standards are also important. They have like 6 performance standards. Okay, we have an answer C. The correct answer is A. So performance standard 1 deals with risk management, and it matches with the assessment and management of environmental and social risks and impacts. Then performance standard 3 deals with resource efficiency, and it matches with resource efficiency and pollution prevention. And performance standard 6 deals with biodiversity, and it talks about biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living natural resources. So P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, and R matches with 1. So A was the correct answer. Moving on to question 12. Under the Environment Protection Act 1986, which of the following rules or standards of CPCB provides for noise? So you have one, noise limits for vehicles and airport, two, noise limits for generator, three, firecracker noise rules for WHO. Okay, this is slightly easy because of the options. So which of the following rules or standards does CPCB provide for noise control? That is what does which of the following rules does the CPCB use for noise control? Okay, so B is the correct answer. The CPCB provides noise limits for vehicles and airports, and it provides noise limits for the indoor environment, example generators and outdoor noise as well. And then it also provides noise rules for firecrackers and their manufacturing and say if they have a noise level limit greater than the specified limit. So B, 1, 2, and 3 are correct. Whereas WHO is an organization who has its own noise level parameters. Okay, so 1, 2, and 3 is correct. Guys were right. Okay, moving on to question 13. Match the theme in group A with their description in group B. So we talked about the gross ecosystem product. And we also have discussed a bit on the access and benefit sharing, ABS. Okay, we have an answer. C is correct. So the gross ecosystem product is the total value of final ecosystem goods and services applied to human well-being in a region annually and can be measured in terms of biophysical value and monetary value. So P matches with 3 is correct. The access and benefit sharing ABS is the system in which genetic resources can be accessed and benefits resulting from it can be shared by users of different countries which provide them. So Q matches with 1. And then R, which is the Payment for Ecosystem Services Program, the PES, talks about market-based approaches which can be used to incentivize the conservation-related activities. So R matches with 2. So the correct option is C, like you said. P matches with 3, Q matches with 1, and R matches with 2. Okay, so moving on to question 14. The Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing, ABS, aims at fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources, including by appropriate access to genetic resources and by appropriate transfer of relevant technologies. So is the statement true or false? So it's basically saying that the access and benefit sharing from the Nagoya Protocol aims at uh, equitable resource sharing, equitable access to resources, and equitable transfer of technologies between the countries. Okay, so we have an answer true. The statement is true indeed. And so the Nagoya Protocol had the vision of by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. So this is basically a collaboration and cooperative um, international agreement. And the statement was true. So moving on to question 15. AHE targets are related to A, conservation of energy, B, conservation of water, C, conservation of biodiversity, and D, none of the above. Okay, so we have an answer C, which is conservation of biodiversity, correct. So the AG targets are related to conservation of biodiversity, and they have 20 targets which talk about understanding values, maintaining biodiversity, addressing initiatives, sustainable production, reducing the biodiversity loss rate, sustainable fishing practices, sustainable management, reducing pollution, invasive species, reducing the coral reef laws, protecting areas, preventing extinctions, conserving the gene pool of diversity of biodiversity, restoring ecosystem, enhancing the resilience of ecosystems, implementing the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing, revising the NBSAPs, respecting and conserving, improving the knowledge base, mobilizing resources. So these are the 20 HE targets. And India also prepared the National Biodiversity Action Plan in 2008. And they they have like 12 national biodiversity targets, which were developed in line with the 20 of these biodiversity targets. So C was the correct answer. So moving on to week 4 assignment. So a lot of these questions from week 4 we have covered in the previous section. So we will just go over the ones which we do not cover in the previous section. So question 2 was, which institute is responsible for management of resources in the coastal water? Nodal ministry with major responsibility for protecting marine environment includes implementation of legislative measures. So we looked at this agency in the Indian institutes and their coastal responsibilities as well. Is it A, the Ministry of Environment and Forests, B, Ministry of Agriculture, C, Department of Ocean Development, and D, Ministry of Water Resources? Okay. So with the key thing to look here is the nodal ministry with major responsibility for protecting marine environment. So the Ministry of Environment and Forests is the nodal ministry which has the major responsibility for protecting the marine environment, and it implements the legislative measures around it. Whereas Ministry of Agriculture looks up at the fishery, aquaculture, and other things. The Department of Ocean Development looks up at the ports and coastal line. The Ministry of Water Resources looks at efficient use of water resources. So Ministry of Environment and Forest is the key major ministry which looks at protecting marine environment. So A was the correct answer. Moving on to question 3, which CRS area is known as intertidal zone. So these CRS areas are also important. And okay. So the correct answer is A, CRS 1B. So whereas CRS 1A is the eco-sensitive area, CRS 2A is the areas which are developed up or close to the shore. Again, they will be divided on the basis of the density, so into 2A and 2B, which we did not discuss. So the correct answer was A, CRS 1B. So you need to remember these eco-sensitive regulation zones as well. Okay, question 4 was, how many biospheres were established by the government of India in the country categories relating to the IUCN? So the options are 10, 14, 18, and 20. Okay. So the correct answer is 18. So India established 18 biosphere reserves, of which we also have some of them included in the UNESCO World Network if they have like a circle around them. So we have a total of 18 biosphere reserves. Okay, moving on to question 10. Which country has not taken part in the project National Capital Accounting and Valuation of the Ecosystem Services, which is the NCAVES project? NCAVES. So there are 5 countries which took part in the project. Okay, so the 5 countries which took part in the project are India, Brazil, China, South Africa, and Mexico. So the country which did not take part in the project is USA. So D was the correct answer. So moving on to question 13, which country initiated the International Union for Conservation of Nature project? The International Union for Conservation of Nature is also known as IUCN, which we have been talking about. So China was the country which initiated the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And then we are the signatory to this union. And we looked up at the key themes and action areas which were identified for India in the different themes of species, biodiversity, business, climate change in the highlight section. Okay, with that, I think we conclude the week 4 assignment section as well. So if you have any queries, you can put them in the chat box, so you can unmute yourself and ask them. So a lot of this uh, week's content was about remembering and understanding the different policies and international agreements around the different environmental parameters, and looking at national legislation and regional legislation from in the Indian context, and looking at the best practices for the different parameters and their codes. So a lot of this is like remembering the important agencies, ministries, and their roles, responsibilities, if they have like key concepts and definitions relating to the content. Okay, and if you have any queries, you can post them in the discussion forums in the NPTEL course. And if you do not have any queries, I will post this video on YouTube. I will post the slides for this session on the Google Drive. So if you go to the NPTEL course, on the left-hand side, you have problem solving sessions in which you have a Google Sheet in which you have links for all of the problem solving session videos so far, and the relevant slides for all of these sessions. So you can access them and listen to them anytime. Please use the discussion forums for putting your questions, because we can address them in these problem solving sessions. And if you have any feedback, you can give it in the feedback forms which you get weekly. Okay, if anybody does not have any queries, we can close this session now. Thank you so much for joining this problem solving session week 4 for the NPTEL course on environmental impact assessment.